When Robert Frost was 38 years old, he was a school teacher in New Hampshire. He was married and had 4 children and had achieved a measure of recognition in his own profession, and of course was secure in it. The only trouble was that he had a fire in his bones. He felt emotions that expressed themselves in thoughts, and he had thoughts that clamored for expression in poetry. Now, what was he to do? Was he to stay in New Hampshire and settle down into the secure life of a school teacher, or was he to uproot his family and leave security behind and try to be a poet? Well, one evening, he wandered into the woods in New Hampshire, and he came to a place where 2 roads diverged. And he felt that his life was at the crossroads, just as he stood at this division of the ways. What was he going to do? Would he go to the left or would he go to the right? He knew that that decision would make all the difference. And of course, we know what he did. He took the road less traveled by and he moved to England with his family, deciding to be a poet. And that's what he became. As a matter of fact, when he wrote the poem, The Road Not Taken, from which we've taken the subject of our sermon this morning, he knew not only that that choice had made the difference, he knew the difference it had made. Because by that time, some of his work had been published and had found acceptance. I'd love to read you the whole poem, but I don't have time. I'll just read you the last 2 verses. You may want to read it for yourself when you go home. It's very beautiful. And both that morning equally lay in leaves no step had trodden black. Oh, I kept the first for another day, yet knowing how way leads on to way, I doubted if I should ever come back. I shall be telling this with a sigh, somewhere ages and ages hence. 2 roads diverged in a wood, and I took the one less travelled by, and that has made all the difference. Now, I bring this to your attention because, you see, the truth is that in every one of our lives there is a road taken and there is a road not taken. If you doubt the truth of that, then the logic of your position, as Dag Hammarskjöld once said, who talked so much about the way and about the path that we choose and about the way that chooses us, the logic of our position would be that we should stand forever at the crossroads. The truth is, if we take one road, we leave a road not taken. And the choice is difficult, and we know that it makes all the difference. Now, that's where some of you are right now, especially those of you who are young people. You have hard decisions to make. You have to decide what you're going to be in life. Are you going to marry Mary, or are you going to marry Joan, or are you not going to marry at all? Are you going to live here, or are you going to live there? Are you going to go out into life and make a living, or are you going to take that graduate course? These are some of the choices that you make. And some of us, indeed many of us, remember having made those choices years ago. Not only did they make a difference, but now we know the difference that they made. We too stood where you're standing, and we know how awful are the decisions that you have to make. Some of us are pleased by the decisions that we made. I don't mean self-satisfied, but life has, in some measure, for many of us, been a fulfillment. We have sung the music that we came to sing. Others are not like that. Their choice has been a disappointment, and looking back, they know that it was, to some measure anyway, a mistake. They have not sung their song, they have spent their time stringing and unstringing their instrument. And for all of us, at least to some measure, there is some sense of regret about roads not taken and about decisions made. Not many of us. Do any of us feel that we have been totally and absolutely fulfilled? Always there is in human life some sense of regret. Now, what I want to do this morning at the beginning of a new year, if I may, how I'd love to be able to speak a word of comfort and strength and reassurance for you. And that's what I'm going to try to do. And here's where we're going to begin. I'm going to begin by noticing that there are some people who are unduly harsh in their judgment about themselves. They blame themselves for making decisions that they made back then, as though they were as wise then as they are now. And they weren't. There is a wisdom that comes with years, and you can't have the wisdom without the years. And yet some people blame themselves as though they should have been as wise as that, when there was no way that they could be. They hadn't lived life, they hadn't had the experience, and so they couldn't speak with all the wisdom of hindsight and with the perspective of retrospect. Now, there's a saying of Søren Kierkegaard that has been strengthening to me since ever I heard it, and that was many years ago. And I've mentioned it to you before. Let me remind you of it this morning. Kierkegaard says somewhere that life must be lived forward, but it can be understood only backward. It must be lived forward, but is understood backward. And that means that to some degree you've got to do the living before you have the experience. There's a sense in which you have to make the decision almost before you're wise enough to make it. Now, we ought to recognize that. And we ought not to blame ourselves as though we had all the wisdom then that we have now. We just didn't. And the truth is that we made the best decision that we could with the information and the wisdom that we had. Now, this is a very obvious truth, and yet we sometimes forget it. Sometimes we express it in a very homey way. We say, you can't put an old head on young shoulders. Well, you can't. And yet sometimes we judge ourselves as though we could. Sometimes we say of a person who isn't very teachable, well, you can't teach him anything. But there are some things that you can't really teach anybody. They must learn them for themselves. The truth becomes their truth only by the process of finding it, living it, and building it into their life. Sometimes we say, only fools learn by experience. But there's a sense in which there are many things that can be learned only by experience. To know them, you have to live them. You can't be wise before the event. Sometimes your wisdom comes only through the experience of living. Let me give you a couple of instances of that. Not long ago I talked to a woman about sorrow. Now, we all know about sorrow. She knew about sorrow all her life. Her friends, some of their husbands had died. She knew that. She had sympathized with them, written them cards, gone to the funeral home. Do you know what she said to me on the phone? She said, this word sorrow, she said, nobody knows what it means. Now, what did she mean by that? Well, what she meant was that she had lost her own husband just a little while before, and suddenly this word sorrow was alive with new power because it was shaped by her own experience. There were depths and dimensions to it that she never imagined until it became her sorrow. I had a friend who was a doctor in Sarnia, and when he was quite elderly, in fact when he had retired from medicine but was just carrying on a little bit of practice, he became a patient in hospital. And he said, Maurice, I wish I'd been a patient when I was a young man. He said, I never knew what it was like. Here was this doctor who'd been going into hospitals all his life, but who had never been sick enough to have to go there. Now he saw it all from a horizontal position, not a perpendicular one. And he began to gather insights into it. He never realized how inconvenient it is to be ill. He didn't realize that one of the things that you have to put up with is the sheer indignity of it. But now he had seen it from another side, and suddenly the experience had come alive for him. I talked to a teenager once, and I just read the 23rd Psalm at a funeral service, and she said, speaking of the words that Kevin sang so beautifully just a few minutes ago, she said, I never knew that the 23rd Psalm could be as meaningful as that. Well, of course she couldn't know. She'd never lost a dear one before. And sometimes people say to me, well, the Bible's irrelevant. When the Bible isn't irrelevant, it's just waiting for them to be wise enough and deep enough and experienced enough to know what it is it's talking about, just as it happened with that young girl. Now, what am I saying? What I'm saying is basically so simple. The truth isn't something you go out and pick up easily. Truth is something that is yours only by finding it and building it into your life by the experience of living. That's how you get wise. Now, thank God we're wiser and have some more insight than we had 5 or 10 or 20 years ago. At least I hope that's true of us. If it's not true, what on earth has been happening to you and me? But we mustn't judge ourselves as though when we made decisions way back then, we had that degree of insight and wisdom. Now, that's a very simple thing to say to you. But it needs to be said because I know so many people who torture themselves because they forget that. And they blame themselves for not being wiser than they were. Well, maybe they should have been wiser than they were, but not with an accumulated life experience. That's just too much to expect. Now, that brings me to the second thing I want to say. And again, it is to mark for us one of the foolish things we do by which we live in a perpetual sense of vain regret. It is that we compare the road not taken with the road taken. We set them beside each other. And then we say, oh, if only we'd taken that other way. Now, what I want you to notice is that that is always an unfair comparison. If you do that, you can't win. No way can you win if that's your procedure. Let me tell you why. Because the road that you took is a real road. And it is limited. It is limited by what has actually happened to you. By the facts of your life, by the people that you've met, by what you have become, by the unavoidable truth of your life and being. I mean, you can't do much with it. That's just there. And when you look back on it, you remember it. There's not much you can do to change it. It's just there, and it has those limitations of being there. But the same thing is not true of the road not taken. You say, well, if only I'd done this. If only I'd done that. And then your imagination can get working. And you know, your imagination is limitless. There is no limit to what you can do with the road not. The road taken is limited by facts and actualities. The road not taken is limitless as your imagination. And you know what we do? We make it perfect. In the road not taken, everything happens for the best. And the people there, they don't grow any older. And we never get to know the dark side of them. In this road not taken, in imagination, they're all perfect and things happen with a kind of rosy glow. And not only that, but we ourselves are so wise in the road not taken. Don't do anything foolish or strange or perverse or sinful. Now, do you see what's happening? This actual life that we have to live is just full of limitations. But the other road not taken, on which we concentrate our attention, it is limitless and boundless, and we can make it glow with radiance. What I want to say to you this morning is that when you make that comparison, it is a false comparison. It isn't really like that. And there are a number of reasons why it isn't really like that. Let me mention them to you. Here's one of them. For example, once you leave what actually did happen to you, you have no way of knowing what would have happened to you. Just acknowledge that this road not taken is, for the most part, a world of fantasy. It is not grounded in reality at all. Now, I know this, because sometimes we all play this game, and it's very easy for me to play it. Sometimes I say to myself, what would have happened if we hadn't come to Canada in 1959? Well, you know, with an imagination like mine, I can make anything. You know, I might have been the Prime Minister. It's highly likely that I would have been the Prime Minister of Northern Ireland. There isn't a single ambition that I can't fulfill. Not only fulfill, but have overflowing, you see. And then I come back and I say to myself, but that's a fantasy world. Oh, it can be harmless so long as you recognize that, but not if you take it seriously. You see, the truth is that I know what happened, and once I'll move from the actual story of my life, I have no idea what would have happened. Maybe I would have been Prime Minister, but it's also possible that the very day after we would have left for Canada, I could have been hit by a truck. I could have been caught in an IRA explosion. I could have been killed by an IRA bullet. Anything could have happened. Once you leave the real world, you see, you just don't know what would have happened. And yet, so often in our fantasies, we just keep on building them, and it's always a perfect world. Here is the second thing we ought to notice. That even that perfect, ideal world of the road not taken, if we had taken it, would have become like every other road, that is, with advantages and disadvantages, with pluses and minuses, with freedoms and with restrictions. The only way that it becomes ideal and perfect is that we didn't choose it. If we had chosen it, it would have been filled with all the ambiguity that your life knows here and now. For example, you married Harry. Harry, who is so dependable, so faithful, always there, but you didn't realize that he had so little imagination. Now, Fred, if you'd married Fred, Fred has so much imagination. And those bits of you that Harry can't bring alive and doesn't even understand, Fred could have done it. See, you get into your fantasy, do you? You get into your fantasy, and if only I'd married Fred, you see, life would have been just so perfect. Do you know why you think that? Because you didn't marry him. Do you know what you would have discovered? You would have discovered if Fred had been brought in from this ideal, perfect world into the actual world, that he too had his strengths and weaknesses, his pluses and his minuses. And some things you would have loved in him, and other things you would have lamented their absence. That's just the way it is. It's so easy to make this world ideal when you don't have to live in it. When you have to live in it, then it becomes actual with all the limitations of the real world. That's the way it is, because nobody's perfect. Remember a few weeks ago I said that in the pulpit. I said, I don't know anybody as perfect. Do you? Now that was a rhetorical question. I mean, I didn't want anybody to stand up and tell me. But after the service, there was a visitor to our congregation, and she said, you know, I was in a church in Florida once. And the minister said that. He stood up at the front and he said, I don't know anybody who is perfect. Do you? And there was a man put up his hand. And the minister said to this man, you mean you know someone who is perfect? He said, yes. And without any hesitation, he went on, my wife's first husband. I mean, it's so easy for them to be perfect, either before we've married them or after they've gone, you know. But in that actual time, don't we simply discover that everybody has their limitations? And that's true of life. To compare this ideal, fantastic world and to live in it is to do a grave disservice to the road which we have taken. And it's a funny story, but there is a serious side to it. You know, Charles Dickens did that. He married his wife, and then he fell in love with his wife's younger sister. She was very young, and when she was very young, she died. But Dickens didn't stop loving her. His thought and affection centered around her memory all through her life. In the meantime, his wife was being worn out with sickness, and she lost her attractiveness in the bearing of his many children. And she just grew older, as the rest of us do. Not her younger sister. She was in this ideal world. Like that figure carved on the Grecian urn of John Keats. She never lost her loveliness. My goodness, how could the poor woman compete with that image? But the image never existed, really. And all the time, when he should have been kind and gracious to his own wife, instead of being as unkind as he so frequently was, he was lost in this road not taken, this person whom he had never really married or really known all that well, but just lived in loving her in his own mind. Here is another reason why we must not spend so much of our time making ideal the road not taken. It's because we're imperfect ourselves. I mean, even if it were a perfect world, we wouldn't be able to cope with it because we're not perfect. We like to think we are, and at the beginning of a new year, which stretches, as we say, clean and open before us, we make our New Year's resolutions. But tell me what happens to them. We very soon give them up, or we fail with them. You know, there's nothing wrong with the new year. It's just that there are resolutions, and we're imperfect. And we've habits, and we've prejudices, and we've weaknesses, and we bring them into 1983. Look, if you're living by New Year's resolutions, you haven't discovered the truth of the Christian gospel. We bring that ambivalence with us. And so it is that however perfect the new year, we very soon make it imperfect. I know ministers who are unhappy in their present churches. And they keep saying, well, maybe someday I'll get a perfect church. They're looking for the ideal church, but they'll never find one because there isn't one. And even if they found one, they would bring their problems with them. Because there's nothing that much wrong with the churches. Some of the problem is in them. And we know this because we know this in ourselves. Albert Schweitzer said once, I've had a great many trouble with a great many people. The person who has given me most trouble is Albert Schweitzer. I've had a lot of trouble with a lot of people. The person who gives me most trouble is Maurice Boyd. And the same thing is true of you. We see this with our friends. We say, well, you know, she's really going to make a mess of that because she can't cope with it because she's got this kind of prejudice or that sort of weakness or some kind of other infirmity. We see it in them and they see it in us. Look, this ambivalence is just part of our life. We may dream an ideal world. There are no perfect solutions. There is no one right way that is ideal. All the time we're living with ambiguities and things of that sort. I must tell you about my friend Harry Moore. Harry was a friend of mine in Sarn. He's a very interesting character. At one time he was a scout for the Detroit Tigers, the baseball team. And the method of finding new players, when one of the scouts, there were a number of them, when one of the scouts saw a fellow who was promising, he would get two others, and the three would go and watch him, and then they'd take a vote on it, and if they voted the right way, they'd sign him, and if they voted the wrong way, then they wouldn't. So Harry saw this young black pitcher and thought he was pretty good, so he got hold of two of the other scouts. He said, come on down, we've got to look at this guy. So they went down to see him, but they voted him down. They voted Harry down. Harry wanted to sign him, but they voted against him, 2-1. So the Detroit Tigers didn't sign Fergie Jenkins. But Harry, as I say, was he wasn't only a baseball scout, he used to write poetry. And for the most part, it was awful. And, nobody knew it better than Harry. He'd tell you that himself. But he kept on trying, and it expressed some sense and awareness of beauty in him. And now and then he'd throw something up that was worth remembering. And I jotted this down, and again, I've thought of this for a number of years. Harry wrote, I wish I had the time gone by and used it differently than I have done. But then 'tis likely soon I'd find I'd made mistakes of another kind. Well, it's exactly right. Isn't it just you and me? This ambivalence runs all through our life. And our Lord said this quite simply. He said it when he told the parable of the wheat and the tares. They grow together. You can't separate them. You can't get the weeds out without pulling up the wheat as well. So he said they must grow together until harvest. And that's your condition and mine. Which brings me to the last thing I want to say to you this morning. Because see, what we ought to do, and Frances said this so beautifully in her prayer, what we need to do is not to give all our attention to the road not taken and weave these magical fantasies that have no ground or basis in reality. What we really need to do is to give our attention to the only road we know, and that's the one we're on, and that needs all our attention. Charles Dickens should have done that. Instead of this fantasy with this other woman, he should have been loving his wife. Maybe he would have made a better marriage of it if he had. Stop dreaming about Fred and learn to appreciate, Harry, what you've actually got, and give your attention to this road that we find ourselves on. This is the only road we know. And it's foolish to expend our slender resources of emotional energy and attention on some fantastic world that never really touches the ground, when all the time there are actual hands and voices and hearts that need our love and our concern here and now. And this is the second thing that we need to do under this heading. We need to learn to appreciate what we've got. Not what we might have had but don't have. Not to be expending our lives by saying, well, if only this or if only that. I might have accomplished this or I might have accomplished that. Look, always there are more things that you might have done than you could ever do. If you do that, you'll never win. The only way to keep your sanity is to concentrate on those things that you have accomplished, that you have done. And sometimes those things are significant. And you ought to be grateful to God for them, instead of lamenting that you didn't do something else. And you parents, for goodness sake, don't waste the joy of your children by saying, well, if only she had done this, or if only he had done that. Learn to love what it is you've got to love now. And make the most of it, and appreciate it, and cherish it. Because it's all you've got. And the only road you have is the road taken. There was a marvelous illustration of this some time ago when I read words written by Victoria de Los Angeles, the exquisite Spanish soprano. She had made a number of recordings with the Swedish tenor Jussi Björling, one of the most musical tenors ever to sing. And they'd made they'd made Il Pagliacci, they had made a recording of La Bohème, they had made a recording of Madame a Butterfly. And there were great plans for other things that they would do together. They were going to record Manon, they were going to record Othello. And then suddenly Björling died. I think he was just 45 when he had a heart attack. 45, 49, I think 45. I mean, that's even younger than I am, my goodness. He was 45 and he had a heart attack and died. And somebody asked Victoria de Los Angeles about this, and they were going on about all that they could have done together. And Victoria de Los Angeles simply said to them, you know, we ought to spend our time being happy for the things that we were able to do. Not just wasting our thoughts and energies in vain regret on the things that we might have done. She said we ought to be glad that there is so much of his music and that people can still hear the splendor of his voice and learn to know and love him. And that brings me to the very last thing that I want to say to you this morning. And it is that we must discover on this way that we have taken the reality of the grace of God. Now listen, here's what the Apostle Paul has to say. Nevertheless, by the grace of God, I am what I am. Do you know what we need to discover? We need to rediscover that apostolic nevertheless. Paul had so many regrets. At one time, he had persecuted the Christian church, and he goes on to say, nevertheless, by the grace of God, I am what I am. You know, the marvelous thing about you is not the sins that you've committed and the foolishness of which you have been guilty and the perverseness which has been part of your nature and mine. The most marvelous thing about you is the grace that's followed you all your life and made you what you are and given you life and being in this very moment, and that's something for which to be thankful. Would God that we could discover that sense of God's grace, that out of all the stuff of our life, good and bad, rich and poor, He has somehow made us what we are. Now, it was a very significant day when Audrey and I visited Malcolm and Kitty Muggeridge in England. The phone had just rung, and Collins had told him that they were going to publish his diaries. And this was great good news. And so we got talking about that. And he talked about a far from perfect life that he had lived. And he said, of course, there are lots of things I regret. But he said, you know, the marvelous thing is that even though there's so many things that I regret, the great thing is that somehow God has been working through all those things to bring me to where I am today and to what I am and to this measure of truth and grace. Now that ought to be true of us. I saw the opposite to that. Some time ago I had a woman sit in my study and she wanted to deny all her past life. She'd had one momentary experience of God, of religious conversion, and in the light of that she wanted to deny everything else that had ever happened to her. And I said to her, as I would say to you, don't be so ungrateful. If God has been present in that moment of light and illumination. Surely that grace was present in everything that brought you to this time and place. You can no more separate a moment of experience than you can separate a wave of the sea from the wave that goes before it and the wave that comes after it. Do you know what we ought to do this morning? We ought to thank and praise God that we are here, open to that grace which follows us all our days, and open to that grace which stretches away out into the future. Somebody said once, and I didn't know what this meant, they said that hope is the same as remembering. And I think it's true. I think at least in part it just means that the goodness and mercy that have followed us are the goodness and mercy that beckon us into a future filled with God. Let me tell you in a closing sentence, I'm not going to spend much of my time, and I'm not going to spend much of my energy on that road not taken. Do you know why? Because it is on this road, the only road that I have, that God is present in His grace. And it is by this road, and by no other, that He will lead me to the land of promise and to the country of the great King. And so it will be with you when once you have discovered the richness of His mercy.